The wind was howling like a wild animal that night in 1867. Samuel Harrison pulled his wool coat tighter as he stepped outside his small cabin to check on his cattle one last time. The storm had been building all day, and now thick snowflakes were falling so fast he could barely see 10 feet ahead of him. Samuel was a simple man who had built his life on the Texas frontier with his own 2 hands. His cabin wasn't much to look at, just for wooden walls, a stone fireplace, and a roof that leaked when the rain came down hard. But it was his home, and after losing his wife and young daughter to fever 3 years back, it was all he had. Left in this world, the cattle were huddled together near the barn, trying to stay warm. Samuel counted them quickly. All 12 were there. Good. He couldn't afford to lose any livestock, not with winter coming on strong. Every cow meant money, and money meant survival out here, where the nearest town was a 2-day ride away. As he turned to head back inside, something caught his ear. It wasn't the wind this time. It sounded like scratching, faint but steady, coming from somewhere near his front door. Samuel paused, listening hard. Wild animals sometimes tried to get inside during bad storms, but this didn't sound like a bear or a wolf. He made his way around to the front of the cabin, his boots crunching in the snow that was already knee-deep. The scratching got louder as he got closer to the door. Then he heard something that made his blood run cold, a weak human voice calling out in words he couldn't understand. Samuel rushed to his door and pulled it open wide. What he saw there nearly knocked him backward. A young girl was collapsed in the snow right on his doorstep, her small fist still raised as if she'd been trying to knock. Her long black hair was tangled with ice and snow, and her clothes, strange clothes he'd never seen before, were torn and bloody. The girl looked up at him with dark eyes that were barely staying open. Her lips were blue, and she was shaking so hard he could hear her teeth chattering. She tried to say something, but the words came out as barely a whisper in a language Samuel didn't recognize. For a moment, Samuel just stood there, not sure what to do. He lived alone out here for good reason. The frontier was dangerous, and you never knew who you could trust. There were wars going on between the settlers and the native tribes, and folks on both sides had done terrible things to each other. But, looking down at this girl, probably no older than 16, Samuel couldn't see an enemy. All he saw was someone who was going to die if he didn't help her right now. Without thinking twice, Samuel bent down and scooped the girl up in his arms. She was light as a feather, and he could feel how cold she was even through her wet clothes. Her head fell back against his shoulder. He realized she'd passed out completely. Samuel carried her inside and laid her down on his bed, the only bed in the one-room cabin. He quickly built up the fire until it was roaring, then went to work, trying to save her life. First, he wrapped her in every blanket he owned. Then he heated water on the stove and used clean rags to gently clean the cuts on her hands and face. The girl's breathing was shallow and fast, like a bird's. Samuel had seen people die from the cold before, and he knew she wasn't out of danger yet. He pulled a chair up next to the bed and sat down to watch over her, adding wood to the fire every hour to keep the cabin warm. Outside, the storm raged on, but inside, Samuel kept vigil over this mysterious stranger who had appeared at his door. He found himself wondering who she was and where she'd come from. Her clothes were unlike anything he'd seen in town, made of soft leather and decorated with colorful beads and small bones. Her skin was darker than his, and her features told him she was from one of the native tribes that lived on these lands. Around midnight, the girl's eyes fluttered open. She looked around the cabin with confusion and fear. Then her gaze settled on Samuel sitting beside the bed. For a long moment, they just stared at each other, neither one knowing what to say. The girl tried to sit up, but Samuel gently pressed her back down onto the pillow. "Easy there," he said softly. "You're safe now. You were nearly frozen to death when I found you." She spoke then, a string of words in her own language that Samuel couldn't understand. But her tone was questioning, maybe asking where she was or who he was. Samuel wished he could explain, but all he could do was point to himself and say, "Samuel, my name is Samuel." The girl nodded slightly, then pointed to herself and said something that sounded like Ayana. Samuel repeated it back to her, and She gave him the smallest smile before her eyes closed again, and she drifted back to sleep. Samuel spent the rest of that night watching over Ayanna, making sure she kept breathing, making sure she stayed warm. He heated soup on the stove and managed to get her to drink a few spoonfuls when she woke up briefly around dawn. She was too weak to sit up on her own, but at least she was alive. As the morning light crept through his small window, Samuel looked out at the world transformed by snow. The storm was finally passing, but it had left behind drifts that were taller than a man. Nobody would be traveling anywhere for days, which meant he and Ayanna were stuck together until the weather cleared. Samuel didn't mind. Truth was, it had been a long time since he'd had another person in his cabin. The loneliness out here could eat at a man's soul, and having someone to care for, even a stranger who couldn't speak his language, felt good in a way he'd almost forgotten. He looked back at Ayanna sleeping peacefully in his bed, her breathing steady now, and her color returning to normal. Whatever had brought her to his door in the middle of that terrible storm, Samuel was glad he'd been there to help. His mother had always taught him that you'd treat people the way you'd want to be treated, no matter who they were or where they came from. What Samuel didn't know, as he sat there watching the sun rise on that quiet morning, is that his simple act of kindness was about to change his life forever. He had no idea that somewhere out there, a powerful man was looking for this girl. And that man was not the forgiving type. For now, though, all was peaceful in the little cabin on the frontier. Outside, the snow continued to fall, gently covering the tracks that had led Ayanna to Samuel's door. Was tied. Two strangers from different worlds were about to learn that sometimes, when you help someone in need, you discover something important about yourself too. The next morning, Samuel woke up on the hard wooden floor of his cabin with a crick in his neck and sore muscles from sleeping without a proper bed. But when he looked over at Ayanna, still resting peacefully under his thick quilts, he knew he'd made the right choice giving up his bed. She was awake, those dark eyes of hers taking in every detail of his simple home. When she saw him stirring, she tried to sit up, but Samuel could tell she was still weak from her ordeal in the storm. "No, no," he said gently, motioning for her to stay put. "You need to rest." Ayanna spoke something in her language, her voice stronger than it had been the night before, but still shaky. She pointed to herself, then to the floor where Samuel had been sleeping, then back to the bed. Even without understanding her words, Samuel could tell she felt bad about taking his bed. "Don't you worry about that," Samuel said, waving his hand. "I've slept on worse places than this floor, believe me." He got up and stretched his aching back, then went to stoke the fire. The cabin was cold. Winter mornings on the frontier were harsh, and the fire had died down to just glowing embers during the night. As he worked to get the flames going again, he could feel Ayanna watching his every move. Once the fire was crackling, Samuel put a pot of water on to boil and pulled out some of his precious coffee beans. Coffee was expensive out here, but he figured if there was ever a time to use it, this was it. He also had some leftover cornbread from 2 days ago and a bit of bacon he'd been saving. While the coffee brewed, Samuel tried to think of how to communicate with Ayanna. He'd met a few folks from different tribes over the years, but he'd never learned any of their languages. Most of the time when settlers and natives met, it wasn't for friendly conversation. He brought Ayanna a cup of coffee, steam rising from the hot liquid. She looked at it suspiciously at first, then took a small sip. Eyes widened with surprise, and she looked up at Samuel with something that might have been gratitude. "Coffee," Samuel said, pointing to the cup. "Coffee." Ayanna repeated the word slowly, her pronunciation careful. "Coffee." "Ah!" "Close enough." Samuel smiled. It was the first time he'd smiled in months. Over the next hour, as Ayanna slowly sipped her coffee and nibbled on pieces of cornbread, Samuel found himself enjoying the simple pleasure of having someone to share breakfast with. He'd forgotten how lonely his mornings had become since his family died. After she'd eaten a little, Ayanna seemed stronger. She pointed to herself and said clearly, "Ayanna." Then she pointed to Samuel with a questioning look. "Samuel," he said, tapping his chest. "Samuel." She tried it a few times until she got it right, and Samuel found himself grinning like a fool. It was amazing how good it felt to hear someone say his name again, As the day went on, they developed their own way of talking to each other. Ayana would point to something and say the word in her language. Then Samuel would tell her the English word. By afternoon, she could say water, fire, warm, and thank you, though her version of thank you came out as tank oo. Samuel learned some of her words too. Pia meant water, Koa meant fire, and when she touched her heart and looked at him, saying, Ahahwe, she understood she was trying to tell him something important about feelings, maybe that she was grateful. The storm had left several feet of snow outside, so they were stuck inside together. Samuel didn't mind. He found himself telling Ayana stories, even though she couldn't understand most of what he said. He told her about his wife Beth and his little girl Lucy, who had been about Ayana's age when the fever took her. She had hair like yours, Samuel said, gesturing to Ayana's long black hair. Not the same color, but just as pretty. She used to braid it every morning before doing her chores. Something in his voice must have told Ayana he was talking about something sad, because she reached out and touched his hand gently. That simple gesture meant more to Samuel than 100 words could have. On the second day, Ayana was strong enough to get up and move around the cabin. She insisted on helping with the chores, even though Samuel tried to tell her she should rest. She helped him prepare meals. He was amazed at how quickly she picked up the routine of his simple life. She also taught him things. When Samuel was struggling to get the fire hot enough to cook their evening meal, Ayana showed him a different way to arrange the wood that made the flames burn much better. When he was having trouble with a tear in his coat, she took some of her own supplies, needles made from bone and thread made from plant fibers, and mended it in a way that was stronger than his clumsy attempts. In the evenings, they would sit by the fire, and Ayana would draw pictures in the dirt floor with a stick. She drew her family, a father who looked strong and important, other people who might have been her mother and brothers. She drew horses and buffalo and wide open spaces that stretched as far as the eye could see. Samuel understood that she was showing him her life, her world. In return, he showed her his few precious possessions, a small painting of his wife and daughter, his father's old pocket watch, and a letter from his brother back east that he'd read so many times the paper was wearing thin. When Ayana saw the painting of Samuel's family, she touched it gently and said something soft in her own language. Then she pointed to the empty spaces in the cabin, the places where a woman's touch would have made things more comfortable, the corners where children's laughter should have echoed. It's gone, Samuel said simply, touching his heart. All gone. Ayana nodded, and Samuel could see in her eyes that she understood loss too. Everyone on the frontier knew about loss. By the third day, they had developed an easy rhythm together. Ayana was getting stronger, and Samuel was feeling more alive than he had in years. Having someone to care for, someone who depended on him, had awakened something in his heart that he thought had died with his family. But he also knew this couldn't last forever. The snow would melt, or at least become passable, and then what? He couldn't keep Ayana here against her will, and he had no idea where her people were or how to find them. He also knew that if the wrong people found out he was sheltering a native girl, it could mean serious trouble for both of them. For now, though, Samuel pushed those worries aside. For the first time in 3 years, his cabin felt like a home. Again, there was laughter when Ayana tried to pronounce difficult English words, warmth when they shared meals together, and peace when they sat by the fire in comfortable silence. Samuel had no way of knowing that this peaceful time was about to end in the most dramatic way possible. He had no idea that Ayana's father was a powerful chief who was already searching for his missing daughter. He certainly couldn't imagine that his simple act of kindness was about to put him face to face with 70 of the fiercest warriors on the entire frontier. For now, all Samuel knew was that helping this young woman had reminded him what it felt like to be human again. Samuel woke up before dawn on the 4th morning, feeling unusually restless. Something was different, but he couldn't quite put his finger on what it was. The cabin was warm from the fire he'd kept burning through the night, and Ayana was still, sleeping peacefully on his bed. But something in the air felt wrong. He lay on his makeshift bed on the floor for a few minutes, listening. That's when he realized what was bothering him. It was too quiet. Living alone on the frontier, Samuel had learned to pay attention to the sounds around him. There were always sounds: wind in the trees, cattle moving around, birds starting their morning songs, even the small creaks and settling noises his cabin made. But this morning, there was nothing. The silence was so complete, it felt like being inside a tomb. Samuel sat up slowly, trying not to wake Ayanna. His back ached from sleeping on the hard floor for 4 nights, but he ignored the pain. Something was definitely not right outside. In all his years living out here, he'd never experienced this kind of absolute silence. He stood up carefully and made his way to the small window near his front door. The glass was frosted over from the cold, so he rubbed a small circle clear with his sleeve and peered outside. At first, everything looked normal. Snow had stopped falling during the night, and the world outside was covered in a pristine white blanket that sparkled in the early morning light. His cattle were nowhere to be seen, but that wasn't unusual. They often wandered behind the barn. When it was cold, Samuel was about to turn away from the window when something caught his eye. At the edge of the tree line, about 100 yards away, something moved. It was just a flash, like a shadow passing between the trees. But it was definitely something big. His heart started beating faster. Could be a bear, he thought. Bears sometimes came around homesteads looking for food, especially in winter when pickings were slim. But bears didn't usually move that quietly, and they certainly didn't move with that kind of purpose. Samuel grabbed his rifle from where it leaned against the wall and checked to make sure it was loaded. Behind him, Ayanna stirred in the bed but didn't wake up. Samuel was glad for that. No point in scaring her until he knew what they were dealing with. He went back to the window and looked out again, this time more carefully. For several minutes, he saw nothing but snow and trees. Then, like ghosts materializing from the morning mist, they appeared. First one, then another, then more and more, until Samuel lost count. Men on horseback, sitting perfectly still among the trees like statues. Even from a distance, Samuel could see they were native warriors. They were all looking straight at his cabin. Samuel's blood turned to ice water in his veins. This wasn't a random hunting party or a group passing through. These men had come here for a reason. And Samuel had a sinking feeling he knew what that reason was. More warriors kept appearing until they formed a complete circle around his homestead. Samuel could see them now on all sides, north, south, east, and west. They had surrounded him completely, and he hadn't heard so much as a whisper of their approach. Samuel had heard stories about native war parties, but he'd never seen anything like this with his own eyes. These weren't young braves looking for glory or raiders seeking easy targets. These were seasoned warriors, and they moved with the kind of discipline that spoke of years of training and countless battles. As the sun climbed higher, Samuel could make out more details. The warriors wore war paint, bold stripes of red, black, and white across their faces and bodies. Their horses were painted too. Symbols and designs that Samuel didn't understand, but that clearly meant something important. Each warrior carried weapons, bows with arrows, lances decorated with feathers and scalps, war clubs that looked like they could crush a man's skull with one blow. Some had rifles too, probably taken from soldiers or traders over the years, but it was their leader that made Samuel's knees go weak. In the center of the group, sitting on a magnificent black and white painted horse, was a man who commanded respect. Just by existing. He was older than the others, maybe 50 years old, with silver streaking through his long black hair. Eagle feathers hung from his hair and his horse's mane, and even from a distance, Samuel could feel the power that radiated from this man. This wasn't just any chief. This was someone important, someone whose word was law among his people. The way he was staring at Samuel's cabin left no doubt about why he was here. Samuel's hands started shaking as the full weight of his situation hit him. 70 armed warriors had surrounded his home, and their leader looked like he could order Samuel's death with a casual wave of his hand. Samuel had heard enough frontier stories to know how these things usually ended. Behind him, Ayanna began to stir. Samuel heard her sit up in bed, probably wondering why he was standing at the window with his rifle. She said something softly in her language, a question by the tone of it. Samuel didn't turn around. He couldn't take his eyes off the scene outside. "Ayanna," he said quietly, his voice barely above a whisper. "I think your father has come looking for you." He heard her sharp intake of breath, then the rustle of blankets as she got out of bed. A moment later, she was beside him at the window, looking out at the circle of warriors. When Ayanna saw the chief on the painted horse, she went completely still. Samuel felt rather than saw her reaction, a mixture of relief, fear, and something else he couldn't identify. She spoke a single word in her language, so softly Samuel almost didn't hear it. But he didn't need to understand her language to know what that word meant. Father. That's him, isn't it? Samuel asked, still keeping his voice low. That's your father out there. Ayanna nodded, her eyes never leaving the figure of the chief. She spoke rapidly in her own language, words tumbling over each other like she was. Trying to explain something urgent, Samuel caught the tone of worry in her voice, maybe even fear. I don't understand what you're saying, Samuel said, but I can guess. He's not happy about his daughter spending 4 days in a white man's cabin. Samuel's mind raced, trying to think of a way out of this situation. The warriors hadn't attacked yet, which meant they wanted something other than just to kill him. Probably they wanted Ayanna back, which made perfect sense. Samuel couldn't blame a father for wanting to protect his daughter, but Samuel also knew enough about frontier justice to understand that taking someone's daughter, even to save her life, might not be seen as an innocent act. Tensions between settlers and natives were high, and trust was something that had to be earned with blood. The chief raised his hand, and immediately every warrior in the circle straightened in their saddles. Even their horses seemed to sense the importance of the moment. The silence, which had been complete before, all felt heavy with the weight of unspoken threats. Samuel realized that the chief was preparing to make his move. Whatever was going to happen next would determine whether Samuel lived through this morning or whether his bones would be left to bleach in the prairie sun. Ayanna, Samuel said, his voice steady, despite the fear coursing through his body. I want you to know that helping you is the right thing to do. Whatever happens next, I don't regret it. Ayanna looked at him with tears in her eyes. She reached out and touched his arm, saying something in her language that sounded like a prayer. Outside, the chief dismounted his horse with fluid grace. He handed his reins to another warrior and began walking toward the cabin with slow, deliberate steps. Every eye in that circle of warriors was focused on their leader as he approached the home of the white man who had sheltered his daughter. Samuel checked his rifle one more time, though he knew it would be useless against 70 warriors. If this was going to be his last morning on Earth, he was determined to face it with dignity. The most powerful chief on the frontier was walking toward his door. Samuel had no idea whether he was about to meet his death or his salvation. Samuel's heart was pounding so hard, he was sure everyone outside could hear it. The chief was getting closer with each step, and Samuel could see more details now that made his mouth go dry with fear. This wasn't just any tribal leader. This was a man who had clearly seen many battles and won them all. Scars crossed the chief's arms and chest, telling stories of fights with enemies, wild animals, and maybe other chiefs who had challenged his authority. His face was painted with bold red and black stripes that made his dark eyes look even more intense. But what struck Samuel most was the way the man moved, not rushed or angry, but with the calm confidence of someone who had never doubted his own power. What do I do? Samuel whispered to Ayanna, though he knew she probably couldn't give him advice that would help much in this situation. Ayanna was watching her father approach, and Samuel could see her hands shaking. She spoke quickly in her own language, words that sounded urgent and pleading. Samuel didn't understand what she was saying, but he could hear the worry in her voice. The chief stopped about 20 feet from Samuel's front door. This close, Samuel could see that the man was even more impressive than he'd appeared from a distance. He stood well over 6 feet tall, with shoulders broad enough to carry the weight of leading his entire people. The eagle feathers in his hair moved slightly in the morning breeze, and the beads and bones decorating his clothes caught the sunlight. For a long moment, the chief just stood there, studying Samuel's cabin like he was memorizing every detail. His gaze moved from the chimneys sending up smoke to the small window where Samuel and Ayanna were watching, to the door that stood between him and his daughter. Then the chief spoke, his voice carrying easily across the distance between them. Even though Samuel didn't understand the words, the tone was clear, This was a command, not a request. The chief wanted Samuel to come outside. "He wants me to face him," Samuel said to Ayanna, "doesn't he?" Ayanna nodded, tears starting to run down her cheeks. She grabbed Samuel's arm and spoke rapidly, clearly trying to tell him something important. Her voice was getting more urgent, and Samuel could see the fear in her eyes, not fear for herself, fear for what might happen to him. Samuel looked down at his rifle, then back at the circle of warriors surrounding his home. Even if he was the best shot in Texas, which he wasn't, he couldn't fight 70 men. If he was going to get out of this alive, it wouldn't be through violence. "All right," Samuel said, more to himself than to Ayanna. "If he wants to talk, we'll talk." Samuel set his rifle down against the wall. There was no point in carrying it outside. It would only make him look like he was planning to fight, and that would probably get him killed before he could say a word. He walked to his door and put his hand on the wooden handle. His palm was sweaty despite the cold morning air. Samuel had faced down angry bulls, fought off wolves, and survived blizzards that would have killed most men. But he'd never faced anything quite like this. Before opening the door, Samuel turned back to Ayanna. "Whatever happens out there, I want you to know that these past few days, having you here, it reminded me what it was like to have family again. That was worth everything." Ayanna said something that sounded like a prayer. Then she did something that surprised Samuel completely. She walked over and hugged him, just for a moment, like a daughter might hug her father before he went off to do something dangerous. That simple gesture gave Samuel more courage than a dozen loaded rifles could have. He opened the door and stepped outside into the cold morning air. The moment Samuel appeared, every warrior in that circle of 70 men shifted slightly in their saddles. Hands moved closer to weapons, and Samuel could feel their eyes on him like physical weight. But none of them moved to attack. They were all waiting for their chief to make the first move. The chief studied Samuel for what felt like an hour, but was probably only a few seconds. Samuel forced himself to stand straight and looked the man directly in the eyes. Even though everything in his body was telling him to run or hide or beg for mercy, finally the chief spoke again, this time clearly directing his words at Samuel. The tone was different now, still commanding but maybe not quite as threatening as before. Samuel had no idea what the man was saying, but he knew he had to respond somehow. "I don't speak your language," Samuel said, keeping his voice as steady as he could, "but I think I know why you're here." The chief's eyes narrowed slightly, and Samuel could see him thinking. Then the man called out something to his warriors, and one of them rode forward. This warrior was younger than the chief, but still looked experienced and dangerous. He dismounted and walked over to stand beside his leader. The younger warrior spoke to Samuel in English, though his accent was thick and some of the words came out wrong. "My chief asks why his daughter is in your house." Samuel felt a tiny bit of relief that he could at least communicate. But he knew his answer could mean the difference between life and death. He had to choose his words very carefully. 4 nights ago, there was a bad storm, Samuel said slowly, making sure the warrior could understand him. "Your daughter came to my door. She was hurt and nearly frozen to death. I brought her inside to save her life." The warrior translated Samuel's words to the chief. Samuel watched the chief's face closely, trying to read his reaction. The man's expression didn't change, but Samuel thought he saw something flicker in those dark eyes. Maybe surprise, or possibly doubt. The chief asked another question, which the warrior translated. "He wants to know why you did not harm her. Why you did not take advantage of a helpless enemy." That question hit Samuel right in the heart. He realized that this father had spent the last 4 days imagining the worst possible things that could happen to his daughter. Samuel had been thinking about the danger he was in, but he hadn't considered the agony this man must have been going through. "'Cause she's just a girl," Samuel said, and his voice was stronger now, "'cause she was hurt and scared and needed help." "I have a daughter too." Samuel paused, his throat tightening. "I had a daughter. She died 3 years ago. When I saw your daughter at my door, I saw my own child needing help." The warrior translated again, speaking for much longer this time. Samuel could see the chief's expression starting to change as he heard the words. The hard lines around his eyes softened just a little, and Samuel thought he saw something that might have been understanding. Behind Samuel, The cabin door opened quietly, and Ayanna stepped outside. The moment the chief saw his daughter, everything changed. The powerful leader, the feared warrior, the man who commanded 70 fighters, all of that disappeared for just a moment. And Samuel saw a father who had been terrified that his child was dead. Ayanna called out to her father in their language, her voice carrying across the snowy yard. Samuel didn't need to understand the words to hear the love and relief in her voice. She ran toward her father, and Samuel saw the chief's face transform, completely as his daughter threw herself into his arms. For several minutes, father and daughter spoke rapidly in their own language, while Samuel stood there feeling like an intruder in their reunion. But he also felt something else, a deep satisfaction that he had been able to bring this family back together. Whatever happened to him next, Samuel knew he had done the right thing. Samuel stood in the cold morning air, watching the reunion between father and daughter, and tried to prepare himself for whatever judgment was coming. He'd seen enough of frontier justice to know that good intentions didn't always matter when cultures clashed and misunderstandings ran deep. The chief held Ayanna for a long time, speaking softly to her in their language. Samuel could see the man's whole body relax as he assured himself that his daughter was truly safe and unharmed. But Samuel also noticed that the chief's eyes kept glancing over at him, studying, evaluating, deciding. Finally, the chief gently pushed Ayanna back so he could look at her properly. He examined her from head to toe, checking for injuries or signs of mistreatment. Samuel watched nervously as the chief's hands moved over the cuts on Ayanna's face and arms, the wound she'd had when she arrived at his cabin. Ayanna began speaking rapidly to her father, gesturing toward Samuel and then toward the cabin. Her voice was animated, almost excited. And Samuel could tell she was telling her father exactly what had happened over the past 4 days. She pointed to her own clothes, which Samuel realized were cleaner and mended now than when she'd first arrived. She gestured to herself, showing how much stronger and healthier she looked. The chief listened intently to everything his daughter said. Samuel watched the man's face carefully, trying to read his expression, but the chief was too experienced at hiding his thoughts. Samuel had no idea whether Ayanna's words were helping his case or making things worse. After Ayanna finished speaking, the chief asked her several questions. Samuel could tell they were questions because of the tone, and he could see Ayanna nodding emphatically as she answered. At one point she actually smiled and laughed, which seemed to surprise her father. Then the chief did something that made Samuel's blood run cold. He walked over to where Samuel was standing, moving with that same calm, purposeful stride that had brought him to the cabin in the first place. The 70 warriors around the homestead all shifted in their saddles, ready to act on whatever order their leader might give. The chief stopped just a few feet from Samuel, close enough that Samuel could see the intricate beadwork on the man's clothing and the deep lines that years of leadership had carved into his face. For a moment that felt like forever, two men just stared at each other. Then the chief spoke. The young warrior who had been translating earlier stepped forward to interpret. "My chief says his daughter has told him many things about you." The warrior said, "She says you gave her your own bed while you slept on the ground. She says you fed her from your own food when you had little to spare. She says you treated her wounds and kept her warm by your fire." Samuel nodded but didn't speak. He sensed that this wasn't the time for words. The warrior continued. "She also says you taught her some of your language, and you tried to learn some of hers. She says you showed her the picture of your own family, and she could see the sadness in your eyes when you spoke of them." Samuel felt his throat tighten at the mention of his lost wife and daughter. Even now, 3 years later, thinking about them could bring him to the edge of tears. The chief spoke again, longer this time, and Samuel could hear something different in his tone. The warrior listened carefully before translating. "My chief says that many white men would have seen his daughter as an enemy, or as something to be used for their own purposes. But you saw her as a human being in need of help. You risked your own safety to care for someone from a people you do not know, whose language you do not speak." Samuel still didn't trust himself to speak, but he felt a tiny spark of hope beginning to grow in his chest. The chief reached into a leather pouch that hung from his belt and pulled out something that made Samuel's eyes widen. It was a necklace. unlike anything Samuel had ever seen, made from silver and turquoise. With beads so perfectly crafted, they seemed to glow in the morning sunlight. But it was more than just jewelry. Samuel could tell from the way the chief handled it that this was something sacred, something important. The chief held the necklace up so all of his warriors could see it, then spoke in a voice that carried clearly across the snowy homestead. Samuel didn't need a translation to understand that this was some kind of ceremony, something formal and binding. My chief says that in all his years as a leader, has met very few white men who showed true honor, the warrior translated. He says that what you did for his daughter shows the kind of character that his people respect above all else. The chief stepped forward and placed the necklace around Samuel's neck. The weight of it was surprising, but it was the symbolic weight that really struck Samuel. He could see the looks on the faces of the warriors around him. This wasn't just a gift. This was recognition of something important. The chief spoke again, and this time his words made Samuel's knees nearly buckle with relief and amazement. My chief declares that you are now a brother to our people, the warrior translated. This necklace marks you as family. No warrior from our tribe will ever raise a weapon against you. Your home is under our protection. Your cattle will not be stolen. Your crops will not be burned. Samuel felt tears starting to run down his cheeks, and he didn't care who saw them. I don't know what to say, he managed. But the chief wasn't finished. He walked over to his magnificent painted horse and led it toward Samuel. The animal was clearly valuable, strong, well-trained, and decorated with symbols that spoke of many successful hunts and battles. This horse is a gift, the warrior translated as. The chief handed Samuel the reins. My chief says it is payment for saving his daughter's life. He says that no debt should go unpaid, and that this horse will serve you well in the years to come. Samuel took the reins with shaking hands. The horse was beautiful, probably worth more than everything Samuel owned put together. But more than that, it was a symbol of trust and respect from a people he had only heard about in stories. Ayanna came over to stand beside her father and Samuel. She looked at both men with obvious pride and happiness, then said something to Samuel in English. Tank uno, she said, her pronunciation still not perfect, but her meaning absolutely clear. Tank uno, for saving my life. Then she hugged Samuel. Again, and this time, her father didn't object. In fact, when Samuel looked up, he saw something that might have been the beginning of a smile on the chief's stern face. The chief spoke one last time to the warrior, who translated with obvious respect in his voice. My chief says that true honor is rare in this world, but when it is found, it should be recognized and rewarded. He says that the story of what you did will be told around our campfires for many generations, so that our children will know that kindness can be found in unexpected places. With that, the chief mounted his horse and called out to his warriors. As quickly and silently as they had appeared, the 70 riders began to fade back into the trees. Within minutes, Samuel was standing alone in his yard with Ayanna and the magnificent horse. I was wondering if the whole thing had been a dream, but the weight of the necklace around his neck and the warm breath of the horse on his hand told him it had all been wonderfully, impossibly real. Ayanna stayed for one more day, helping Samuel learn how to care for his new horse and teaching him a few more words in her language. When she finally left to rejoin her people, Samuel felt sad to see her go. But he also felt something he hadn't experienced in years, hope for the future, as he watched her ride away across the snowy plains. Samuel touched the necklace at his throat and smiled. Sometimes he thought, doing the right thing really does make all the difference in the world.